Hi guys, and welcome back to Stir Crazy. My name's Jake, and as the name says, today I'm going to be taking you through gin's history on a tasting course, exploring the 500 years that gin has been around. So yeah, slightly different box this week, guys, similar to the whiskey tasting box that we did for Burns Night, except this time we're going to be exploring gin and, you know, its history from its Dutch origins right up to the gin craze that we've been experiencing for the last 20 years or so. So as always, guys, in your box, you should have 6 bottles, bottles 1 to 6. These are the 6 gins that we are going to be tasting, and they are in the same order that I've got them here, from my right to left. You should also have 2 unmarked bottles, guys, and an unmarked pouch. Those are our cocktails that we're going to be trying at the end of the masterclass as well, guys. I would recommend with the pouch cocktail, that's our ready-to-drink martini. We want to make sure that one is icy cold, as it is best served cold. So if you want to pop that one in the freezer now, as we don't need to do anything to that one is ready to drink. So if we get that one in the freezer, get that nice and cold for when we're going to be drinking it. And then the 2 unmarked bottles, I'll explain what we're going to be doing with those later. You should also have a lemon as well, guys. We're going to be using the peel from this lemon and the juice as well, guys. But don't worry about that. We'll get to that when we are making the cocktails. You should also have some freeze-dried raspberries as well that we're going to be using to garnish one of our cocktails. So yeah, without further ado, guys, let's get going. So before we get into our first spirit, we always talk about it, but what is gin? Well, gin is categorized in lots of different styles, and we're going to be exploring them today. But in its essence, it is a neutral spirit that botanicals have then been added to, either through infusion or through a second distillation, essentially kind of making gin in a rough form a sort of flavored vodka. Or, as I like to call it, vodka is more like unfinished gin. The common theme around all of these spirits is going to be the juniper berry. It is the predominant flavour in gin, and it's the thing that is categorised as the most botanical, the essential botanical when creating gin to this day. It's juniper, and if you ever smell juniper berries, you get that fresh gin scent. So it does quite literally span about a 500-year life, but where its origins lie is in a spirit that is quite far from what I know and what we know as gin, and that is the Dutch spirit jenever. So jenever is a Dutch originated juniper flavored spirit. Today we're going to be trying the Bols Zeer Oud jenever. That quite literally translates to old style jenever, and as you can see by the old ceramic style bottle that they're using, this is a very old style of spirit. Where jenever comes from, well, I'll get a little bit into that in a second, but first of all, let's try this spirit and see what we think about it, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the history about where it comes from. So you've already got a little measure in your bottles, guys, so just pour that into a little glass, and we're going to go for a little sip. So just go for a little nose first, guys, before we try. We always want to sort of nose a spirit before we taste it, just to see what sort of aromas we're going to get on the top of the spirit. So straight away you're going to see that this is a malt heavy spirit. It's really malty. That's the sort of immediate hit that I get. Unlike gin, where you sort of get botanicals and juniper berries first, the first thing I get when smelling this spirit is malt. The closest thing I can relate it to is it sort of smells like when you're making bread. You've got that second proof going on in your kitchen. You can sort of smell the yeasts activating and things like that. That's the sort of thing I get with it. But yeah, super malty on the nose. Even sort of, it's slightly sweet as well. So go for a little taste now, guys. For the first taste, just take a little sip and swallow that right down, sort of preparing your palate for the spirit that we're about to taste, and then take another sort of larger swig and give it a little taste. So things I get from this straight away is it is sweet in style, and when I mean sweet, I don't mean sweet like a liqueur sweet. I mean it's got a sweetness to it, and that comes from the fact that it's a 35% product. So it means it's not full spirit strength at 40%, or sorry, at 39%. So it's a little bit easier to consume. And what that means by it not being the full strength stuff, as it's not been distilled to the high ABVs, is that lots of the natural characteristics from the base product are going to come through in this spirit as well. So lots of that malt, and you're going to have that juniper berry coming through as well. And essentially what this sort of is is it's more akin to a whiskey than it is to a gin. If you think about whiskey as being a malt spirit that's been malted barley that's been distilled, this has a lot of characteristics with whiskey. Essentially, what they do is they take a malt wine or a fermented malt mash. In this case, with the Bols Zeeoud, they use a combination of rye, corn, and wheat. And they take this mash. They then ferment this into a sort of malt wine, and then they distill that with some juniper berries to create the Bols Genever. So essentially, it is a malt wine distillation that has been flavored with juniper berries. Why they use juniper berries? Well, I'll get a little bit into that, but essentially, when they were first making this spirit, as we know now, distillery practices were not the best back then. So usually things like juniper berries, other spices would have been used to enhance and improve on the flavor of the spirit. So, the reason we've chosen Bols. Bols is one of the oldest spirit producers in the world. The distillery where this stuff is made was first set up in 1575 in Amsterdam. It was quite literally a shed when they first set it up, this tiny little shed. And eventually, when Genever kicked off, Bols kicked off, and they grew and grew and grew as a company. And actually, most of you will probably be quite familiar with Bols as that sort of, the first things you would have tried from Bols might have been something blue or something minty, as they were quite famous for their liqueurs in the 80s and 90s. And to this day, it's quite common to go into sort of cocktail bars and see a lineup of different Bols range. But they started off as a Genever producer, and this is the sort of product that they would have created. So that's why we've chosen Bols, as one, they create an old style Genever, Zeeoud, and they are quite literally one of the oldest spirit producers in the world. But where does Genever come from? Well, before we get into Genever, we got to talk a little bit and catch up on where distilling comes from, because it sort of always ties into this story of distillation. So juniper has always been used as a wonder drug all over the world for centuries. It's always been thought of as curing different ailments. There's quite literally hundreds of different uses of it, examples of its uses throughout history, of how it's been used for curing ailments and as sort of like quite literally a wonder drug. Now, it joins the story of distillation around the time that the Europeans first started to learn distillation. So European alchemists dubbed these wine distillates that they created aqua vitae, water of life, sort of relating to that original story of Geber and trying to create the elixir of life. So what first started off as medicinal remedies, and this is where the juniper berry comes into it, as it would have been a part of something that would have been used in distillates as we wanted to create medical remedies. What started off is that they realized that when you consume enough of these distillates, you got pretty jolly and you got pretty happy. So they started to become recreational delights. So cut forward a little bit, you get to the early 16th century. You find that at the time, people were using what they had the most excess of to create their distillates. If you had an excess of wine harvest, you would use wine to create your distillates. In Scotland, they had an excess of grain, barley, hence Scotch was created. In the early 16th century, they were in the Low Countries, which sort of eventually would become Belgium and the Netherlands. They had about 2 decades of poor grape harvests. So distillers needed to turn to something else to create their spirits, so they turned to beer. They created this fermented mash of rye and malted barley, and this would eventually become known as malt wine, and its distillate would become known as grain burnt wine, as the act of distilling is quite literally to them burning the mash to create this clear spirit. Now, if you were then to further flavour this spirit that they were creating, this malt distillation, it would adopt the name of its main ingredient to avoid confusion. Eventually, someone decided to use juniper berries. Obviously, they would have been in abundance as they were used in medicinal purposes. Someone used juniper berries. The French word for juniper is Genever. And we have essentially the earliest form of Genever born. It was worth noting around this time, what would become known as the 80-Year War broke out between the Protestants of the Low Countries, who were rising up against their then ruler, Spain. And this plays into a story that we'll get to in a little bit. But essentially what happened was many people fled the area because of war and moved further into the Netherlands. They went north. And one family in particular who moved into that sort of area was the Bols family. They moved from France into the Netherlands. They moved around a little bit, but they eventually settled in Amsterdam. And that was when they opened their distillery and started producing their spirits. Now, jump forward a little bit further in time, enter a chap by the name of William of Orange, the Dutch-born would-be King of England. So, He landed on our shores in 1688 in Brixham, nonetheless, just down the road from us here in Teignmouth. And it became known as the Bloodless War, as Parliament basically opened the doors for him. He was a Protestant ruler and wanted to rule in a Protestant way, and we'd grown very bored of our current James II, a Catholic ruler, and Parliament was pretty much done with him. So when William of Orange landed and invaded, they pretty much just went, cool, we'll have you. And then James flew off to France. Now, two things William of Orange did that were crucial to the birth of gin and also the introduction of Genever to our sort of culture. He banned French products and declared war on France. So at the time, people were used to drinking French cognac. That was the thing that they were accustomed to and consuming. He banned all French products, so they had to turn to something else, and he would have brought with him Genever. Now, it's worth noting at this time, Genever had existed in English culture, and it first came to us through our military. So as I said before, the Netherlands and the Low Countries were fighting this Protestant war against Spain, Catholic rulers, and they enlisted the help of our troops to go over there and help in the war. And when we went over there, what we discovered was whenever the Dutch soldiers would charge into battle, before they did that, they had a little hip flask that they would then open up and take a swig of. In this hip flask, they had their own measure of Genever. And this is where we get the term Dutch courage from. So, another thing that he did that gave birth to Genever's popularity and distillation popularity growing in the UK is he, first of all, sort of relaxed the taxes on cereals, and he also loosened the laws around distillation. Now, what old William's laws did is it made spirits literally cheaper than beer. Boo-hoo to breweries, woo-hoo to distilleries. Now, it was super, super easy and cheap to distill, but this meant that knowledge and quality worsened. Lack of expertise led to people ignoring the Genever practices that they were taught by the Dutch, and instead, even down to the point of using the all-important malt wine. Essentially, they just started taking neutral spirits and flavouring them with whatever they could get their hands on, the cheaper the better, to try and create this malty juniper-flavoured spirit. So we were just taking neutral spirit that other people were producing and infusing it with different botanicals, just trying to get it to taste good. Like I said, distillery practices were real poor at this moment. Like I said, anyone could distill. There wasn't much regulation around it. There wasn't much control around it. And the distillation methods that we were using were quite basic. We hadn't perfected certain things that would give birth to the sort of quality gin that we know today. So things started to get a little bit out of hand. It was, in the sense of a word, deadly. People were quite literally dying from this stuff. The things they were adding into it, when consumed in high quantities, could literally kill you. They used whatever they could get their hands on, turpentine, cleaning solutions, like anything that they could use to flavour it, all these different oils they were using, nothing that was supposed to be consumed in high quantities. So they were quite literally making deadly spirits. Now, this couldn't have come at a more convenient and worse time. Conditions in England at this time were pretty poor, and if you didn't have a good wad of cash in your pocket, you were going to be living in pretty hard times. The poorest areas of London were pretty rough places to live. Around this time, work was at an all-time low. If you were born into a household, you were usually sold off to the workhouse for a bit of cash. More people were dying than were being born, and this was a rough time. Poor sewage, unclean drinking water. It was rough. It was rough times. So what did the people turn to? They turned to the cheapest thing that could get them drunk and make them forget about all their worries, which was gin. It would eventually become an epidemic, a social drug preying on the poor and vulnerable. And it lasted so long due to the fact that the upper classes were ignorant. This was around 1714. So they were ignorant to what was happening and what was going on in these places, but people were dying and there was some horrendous stories of it. Today, it's quite common to refer to gin as mother's ruin, but the actual origins of that story are pretty ghastly. There was a lady by the name of Judith Dufour who was living in pretty squalor conditions. One day she sold her child to the workhouse, who clothed her, fed her, and put her to work. She then got her child back for one weekend, and when the workhouse asked where she was, they found Judith drunk in the streets, and it had conspired that Judith had strangled her child to death, taken her clothes, and sold it for gin. So this was a pretty dark time in London's history, and a pretty dark time in gin's history as well. Poets, playwrights, and journalists finally started paying attention to the chaos that was unfolding in the poorer areas of the city. The artist William Hogarth unveiled his etching Gin Lane, portraying the horrors that the rest of the city had been blind to up until this point. If you check your insert, we have actually included a little etching of Gin Lane, or if you fancy doing a quick Google, you can get a picture of it. Now, within this picture, if you look, it's one of those pictures, the more you look at it, the more you see. The city is in chaos. There's death and destruction everywhere. The woman front and center of the picture who is taking a swig of gin while her child falls out of her arm. There's many to say that this is actually Judith Dufour herself. It's chaos, and there's people, queuing up outside the pawnbrokers and the lending shop to sell all their possessions to buy gin. And this was, as Hogarth described, a sort of portrayal of the horrors that took place in London at the time. What we now know to be true is that this was actually an early form of propaganda. Hogarth also painted a sister piece called Beer Street. Now, at the time, if you were overweight, it was a sign of wealth in the country. It showed that you had the money to afford good food, and you indulged yourself in it. So if you look at Beer Street in comparison to Gin Lane, all the characters are overweight, they're jolly, they're drinking beer, the city is being constructed, there's great things going on. It shows the city in splendor, as opposed to Gin Lane, which shows the epidemic of the gin craze. And later it turns out that William Hogarth was sort of under the payment of breweries who decided that they wanted their share, not just their share of the market, they wanted their control of the market back. So they paid him to etch Gin Lane and Beer Street as an early form of propaganda. But what really put an end to this gin craze and this chaos, and then would eventually lead to us gaining the spirit that we consume today, was the Gin Acts. The Gin Acts were 6 pieces of law that would put an end to the freedom of distillation by any person, laws that still hold relevance to today. Each act was introduced to help strengthen the previous, as they didn't always work and they had to keep introducing them. Some things were as simple as fining people for unlicensed selling of gin or street selling of gin. One act in particular gave birth to the gin brand today that we know now as £50 Gin. They get their name from an act that introduced a license fee of £50 to produce gin. At the time, that was the equivalent to around £12,000. So that helped really eliminate a lot of the lower style distillers. The fees for unlicensed sale of street selling were extortionate. So this led to people turning to more creative ways to sell their illegal gin, and this gave birth to the next style of gin that we're going to be trying, Old Tom. So where does Old Tom come from? What is it? Well, in the height of these gin acts and all that was going on, there was a chap in particular by the name of Captain Dudley Bradstreet. He researched the gin acts with a fine-tooth comb, and he found a loophole that he took advantage of. This said that an informer, e.g. someone who was going to dob in an illegal gin distillery, must know the name of the person renting a property to have the authority to break into the premises in order to arrest the transgressors of the act. So, in 1738, Dudley had an acquaintance rent a house in the city of London. He then nailed a sign of a cat in the window, and under its paw he concealed a lead pipe. He let it be known the gin would be available from a cat in the alley on the following day, and moved in with supplies of food and £13 worth of gin purchased from Mr. Langdale's distillery in Holborn before barricading himself into the house. So, his patrons would approach the cat sign. They would then utter the password puss. Dudley would then utter back the password's response mew if gin was available. His patrons would then push a coin through a slot in the cat's mouth, and Bradstreet would in return pour gin down the pipe to trickle out from under the cat's paws. The authorities found themselves powerless to act, and Bradstreet apparently profited from his scheme for 3 months before so many copied him that competition caused him to move on, as this custom became known all over London. Years later, in 1755, Bradstreet wrote about his exploits in a book entitled The Life and Uncommon Adventures of Captain Dudley Bradstreet. In this, he described how he overcame the Gin Act. There was no evidence linking Bradstreet to the term Old Tom. It's many people's belief that Bradstreet's cat and the term Old Tom are coincidental, and that Old Tom actually originated in the 1830s in deference to the distiller Thomas Chamberlain. He did, however, start the trend for what would become known as the Puss and You houses. Vendors would sit concealed within a premises, and customers wanting to buy a gin would say Puss, and then you would be the response, so on and so forth. These human vending machines were found all over London, and for a short period, the subterfuge succeeded in stifling attempts to enforce the 1738 Gin Act. Now, that's sort of where we get the origins of Old Tom. Eventually, Old Tom would become an actual common-made style when gin sort of comes back in a good way. And that's more common to what we're going to be trying right now, which is the Poetic License Old Tom Gin. So today we're going to be using the Old Tom from the people at Poetic License. The thing I like about this one, and the reason I think it's a good one to use, is they haven't added any sweeteners to this as well. While Old Tom gins would have been considered sweet, they wouldn't have added things like sugar or any other sort of sweetness to them because they were very expensive. They wouldn't have had access to things like this. They would have relied on the botanicals they use to add the sweetness. This is where Poetic License get their tagline from, is that they claim that there is no sugar added, with makers saying, from the botanicals alone we nurture its sweet taste. So if you grab bottle number 2, guys, and add that one into your glass, pour myself out a measure here. Now, like the Yeneva, you're going to see that this one has a slight bit of colour to it, as it has seen some slight aging in a cask. Clear but not bright, with a light sort of rose gold amber to it. Now, the main botanicals that have been added to this one to sort of nurture that sort of sweetness that we're looking for is hibiscus flowers and rose petals as well. This is going to give that sort of lovely floral notes on the top of the spirit, as well as sort of some lovely sweetness to it as well. For me, on the aroma, you get that sort of piney juniper that you're getting with gin. Now, for me, Old Tom is sort of like the missing link between Yeneva and London Dry, as it is drier than Yeneva, but it's sweeter than London Dry. It sort of acts as a thing in the middle. So when you give this one a taste now, guys, it is going to be a lot drier and a little bit more spicy than the Yeneva, and it's going to be a little bit stronger as well, so you're going to get that sort of more slight alcohol burn. This might be the time to add some water to it if you want to, but it's got a strong juniper flavour, way stronger than found in the Yeneva. It's got those sort of lovely pine notes. You get a little bit of sometimes black tea in there as well. Cracked black pepper is also found to give it that sort of spiciness. And sort of some nice floral notes you're going to get from the rose. So eventually it would become a style in its own, and as we get to eventually, I will talk about the gin palaces and how they would house Old Tom as a style of gin found within there. Now, gin it takes a turn at this point. It was essentially something looked upon as a drug that was killing the lower classes. The Gin Acts all but eradicated the production of gin. Now, what really put the nail in the coffin was in 1757, English grain distilling was banned. The 1757, the harvest failed, and fearing a bread shortage, exports of corn and malt were banned, as was all distillation of wheat, barley, malt, or any other grain. This was intended to be a temporary measure, but when the 1758 harvest proved little better, the ban was extended. Spirits were still being made from imported sugar molasses, but due to the high cost, production was comparatively small, and so the spirits that were available were priced beyond the reach of the poor, putting a nail fully in the coffin. Gin was purchased because it was cheap. It was no longer cheap, so therefore the poor were no longer purchasing it. So sobriety prevailed, and London enjoyed growing prosperity and many civil improvements to its infrastructure, with the construction of new roads and the introduction of street lighting, which is going to help improve all sorts. London's standards of living rose for both the rich and poor alike. The gin craze was over and living was getting better. So in 1760, grain distilling was restored. It was a bountiful harvest in 1759. This led to distillers and farmers to lobby for distillation to be legalized. They wanted distillation back. However, their demands were countered by those of moral reformers, a stronger church, and the growing middle classes who argued for out-and-out prohibition. You got to think, they were seeing the effects of what had happened because of the gin craze. So much like prohibition in America in the 1920s, they were demanding for prohibition now because no one wanted to go back to where we'd been a few decades before. However, the lack of availability of gin was causing rum imports to rise, and this, along with the preference for the government to earn excise duty from domestic distillers, led to a compromise. In March 1760, a bill restored corn distilling, but with double the levels of previous excise duty. Sorry, poor words. Britain's distillers also benefited from the introduction of subsidiaries for all spirit exports. The cost of getting drunk on spirits was now greater than that of getting drunk on beer, so the urban poor simply returned to beer. Meanwhile, the expensive gin found new respectability, and regulation of distilling led to an improvement in quality and the growth of a handful of dominant distillers. These became known as the gin families of London. One in particular, in 1761, Greenall's Gin was established. In 1769, you had the foundation of Gordon and Company. In 1769, Alexander Gordon established Gordon and Company in London's Bermondsey. Sorry, I'm going to get these words correct. Now, before we get on to more London-style gins and London dry gin, we're going to cover our next style, which is Plymouth. So in 1793, Plymouth Gin was established. So the Blackfriars Distillery, where Plymouth Gin is made, was set up in 1793 when the Coates family joined the established distilling business of Fox and Williamson and converted the old Blackfriars Monastery. Now, this building in Plymouth is ripe with history. It's considered the oldest building in Plymouth, and the evidence of what the building once contained is evident all over this distillery walls. Anyone who watched our Plymouth Devon Gin masterclass, we actually went down to Plymouth and had a tour and chat with the master distiller and got to see the building, and it is full of history and heritage. Like I said, it was home to the Blackfriars monks, which, as you can see by the bottle, hopefully you can work that out, they are a tribute paid to them on the back of the bottle there, and a lot of their imagery throughout the years contained the monks. They were called the Blackfriars monks thanks to the black tunics that they wore. It was also apparently the resting place of the Pilgrim Fathers the night before they travelled to America, and they obviously set sail on the Mayflower, and obviously that is what is found in the centre of Plymouth's logo, which is the Mayflower. So the Coates family made a gin that was fuller flavoured, with less citrus and more pungent root flavours than what would be the typical London dry counterparts. And what really helped establish Plymouth's position in the world was the fact that the Royal Naval Dockyards happened to be just behind the distillery. This helped give Plymouth a global audience. Now, if you think the Navy or the East India Trading Company took your navy all over the world, Plymouth was taken all over the world by the Royal Navy. They got a taste of this spirit, and they decided to make it part of their rations. Now, gin had become something that was purchased by a wealthier class of people. Now, the price of it had gone up, and thanks to new distilling techniques, which we'll get to in a second, the quality had gone up. So they weren't going to just give this spirit to anyone on the ship. It was reserved purely for the naval officers. They got their gin ration, which would have been Plymouth at its navy strength, whereas the regular sailors would have got their rum, as that was considered at the time a cheap spirit to consume. We got navy strength gin thanks to the Royal Navy in Plymouth. Essentially, when they would store their gin and rum on their ships, they would store it next to the gunpowder, as space was not in abundance on these ships. And they wanted to make sure that it was going to, if it was, let's say, worst case scenario, the cask split open and soaked the gunpowder, they wanted to make sure that they could still light it on fire if they were to get into battle. So the quartermaster, who would be in charge of purchasing the gin and rum rations, when he would go into town, he would take with him a little bag of gunpowder, as obviously things like rectifiers and things to measure ABVs did not exist at the time. This is how we got our term proofing. He would take the spirit that he was about to purchase, mix it with the gunpowder and light it. Now, if he mixed it and it lit it and it burnt and it popped and burnt, that meant that it was overproof. That meant it was the correct proofing to work. If it didn't light at all or it burnt very lightly, that meant that it wasn't strong enough, therefore he wouldn't purchase it. This is where we get the term proofing, and the terms like overproof come from. So that's where navy strength comes from. Now, Plymouth was an incredibly popular brand with the Navy, and it happened to be like that for quite literally centuries. There was a famous story that in World War II, obviously London was bombed to oblivion, but also so was Plymouth, because there was a Royal Naval Dockyard there. And apparently when some of the higher up in the Navy got wind that Plymouth had been bombed and the distillery had been bombed, they turned and they said, well, now Hitler really has lost the war. You can attack our cities, but don't you dare attack our gin. And this was sort of the reputation that gin developed with people. Other naval towns did have other distilleries, such as Bristol and Liverpool. They had their own supply of gin. Plymouth was the most popular. Plymouth Gin is the only vintage gin brand to still be made at the same distillery in which it was created. Now, that's enough about a little bit of the history about it before I get into some further details and the distillation methods that help give birth to these new spirits. Let's try some Plymouth. So guys, grab bottle number 3 from your box and empty that into your glass that contains your Plymouth. So Plymouth is made in a 7,000 litre copper pot still, which has been in regular use at this distillery for over 150 years. The 7 botanicals used in order of dominance are juniper. Obviously, gin is not gin without juniper. Then it's coriander, lemon peel, sweet orange peel, sweet angelica, orris root, and cardamom. No bitter botanicals are used, but what is different about this style and what gives it its distinctiveness is the fact that it is much more earthy than citrusy. It has a more earthiness. There's lots more roots used in this one. There is some citrus there. You've got lemon and orange, but it's the roots that are used in this gin that gives it its distinctive style. And you'll get that on the nose. And then also, as you taste it, it does have that sort of more slightly earthy kick to it. On the nose, like with the Old Tom, much more juniper. We're getting closer and closer to that style of gin that we talk about, that London Dry that all of you are probably quite familiar with. And I think I get some quite florally notes on this one as well. But like I said, as always, guys, find your botanicals, find your notes. What do you get from this gin? What do you enjoy about it? Let's go for a taste. Now, you see, I get the zest. I get the little bit of zest and citrusiness that is there, but it is, like I said, it is way more earthy. It's got those sorts of roots in there that just gives it that sort of earthiness in the base of it as well. You get that slight sort of dryness and citrusiness that you get along your palate line, but then I get those sort of heavy earthy notes in it as well. But it's a great gin for me. It's a local gin to us as well. There's a lot of heritage, but it's great as well because it is known the world over. It is its own style of gin. I think it was something crazy like the Savoy Cocktail book. Majority of the cocktails in that book are gin based, and the one that is referenced the most, the style of gin that is referenced the most, is Plymouth. It is a style in itself used the world over. And when people are talking about different styles of gin, it's always great to hear Plymouth mentioned. Obviously, we're now looking hopefully like restrictions are going to get lifted soon. So I would encourage anyone in the area, please do head to the distillery. They've got a gorgeous bar in the upper levels, the refectory bar, where they can serve you some beautiful Plymouth gin cocktails, and take the distillery tour. They show you how they make their gin, and if you do the master distillers tour, if I remember correctly, you even get to make your own little bottle of gin at the end as well. So you get to see, that's quite fun as well, because you can see actually how difficult it is to nail those botanicals and get them right. Usually you find that you screw it up when you're making it. But yeah, that's Plymouth, guys. That's Plymouth in its own style, and we wanted to reference that because it is a style of gin in itself. But in this sort of new era of gin and these distilleries popping up, this industrial revolution of gin, there was one style in particular that took over, which is London Dry gin. So now we head into essentially the gentrification of gin. So this was at the sort of the turn of the 19th century. The London's gin craze and the deprivation of all of that had been forgotten. And the early 1800s saw gin enjoy a new respectability. With this gentrification came gin palaces and Old Tom gin. Like I said, guys, it started off as that old school style, but eventually became a style in itself, and eventually would lead to London Dry as well. So in 1828, you saw the first gin palace open up. Now, up until this point, gin, like I said, was being consumed, in the gin craze, was just being consumed on the streets, in alleyways, and all sorts of different places. 1820 saw the establishment of London's first licensed public houses selling beer. So this sort of early bars, pubs. Their numbers quickly multiplied, and many streets boasted a pub on every corner and several in between. These early pubs were simply converted homes, hence the term public house, most in a very poor state of repair, and this led to magistrates to start demand improvements before issuing licenses, making sure that standards were being met. It became commonplace for landlords to receive money from brewers to renovate their pubs on conditions they signed a sole supply contract with that brewer. This is quite common still to this day. These became known as tied houses. In 1825, the government slashed spirit duties with a dramatic effect that within a year, spirit production more than doubled to hit levels not seen since 1743 around the gin craze. These distillers were doing well and sought to complete with the growing numbers of upmarket pubs. They replaced the traditional gin shops with opulently decorated establishments, which soon became known as gin palaces. These buildings were gorgeous. I mean, you can only see illustrations of what they might have looked like, but they were incredibly beautiful. They were lit by gas lights. Their interiors were furnished with polished carved mahogany and embellished with brass, engraved glass, and mirrors. They were a sight to behold. Henry B. Fearon is credited with being the pioneer of the gin palace. It is said that he opened the first near St Andrew's Church at 94 Holborn Hill, London, circa 1828. In his Sketches by Boz, Charles Dickens famously writes of a gin palace, perfectly dazzling when contrasted with the darkness of dirt we have just left. So this was one of the things that helped give gin its new upmarketness. You can now, rather than purchasing it from a dark alley, from a cat picture, or from a street vendor just on the street selling you sort of deadly, nasty gin, it was now sold in these beautiful, expensive, high-end, artful, almost Art Deco of the day palaces. A prolific Victorian architect helped design Thompson and Pearson and many other of the early gin palaces. Their design was based on the style of upmarket shops of the era and would influence that of pubs throughout the rest of the 18th century. So this is what gave birth to the styles of, this is what took pubs from what we see them back here in Devon into the sort of upmarket bars and pubs that we see now in places like London. The period also saw upmarket London department stores opening, such as Harvey Nichols, Harrods, and Liberty. So this was London entering its new age. By the late 1840s, there were more than 5,000 gin palaces in the London area alone. And remember, in those days, that did not include areas such as Kensington and Mayfair, which were then still country villages yet to be engulfed by the city. Obviously, London has grown and grown and grown over the years as it keeps going. So these establishments sold much more gin, and the name gin palaces is now also applied to similar splendid Victorian pubs, opened by brewers rather than distilleries. Sadly, none of the original gin palaces survived, but there are actually some pubs you can go to in London that still have some of the Victorian opulence around them. So more and more distilleries are popping up. In 1829, the Chelsea distillery is licensed, and this gave birth to the origins of Beefeater gin. In the Chelsea Gin Distillery, operated by John Taylor and Son, which was built during the 1820s and licensed in 1829. In 1863, a chap by the name of James Burrough paid £400 to purchase the distillery and renamed the firm John Burrough, distiller and importer of foreign liqueurs. Burroughs did not create the Beefeater gin brand until around 1876, though, but this is sort of its origins. It's also noted around this time, in around 1823, Geneva arrived in the USA, but it was not really known as Geneva. It was known as Holland gin or Dutch gin in America. We had adopted the name gin at this point very simply by just taking the word Geneva or Geneva, just shortening it down to gin. It's just quite common practice when people import spirits and sort of adapt them for their own. So eventually it arrived in the USA and it did grow to some popularity in the USA, but it was known mainly as Dutch gin or Holland gin. In fact, you can look at old recipe books from around the 1800s, cocktail recipe books, and they will reference recipes using Holland gin or Dutch gin. In 1830, the Tanqueray family, their gin is established. The Tanqueray family were originally silversmiths who left France for England in the early 18th century, where 3 successive Tanquerays become rectors in Bedfordshire. And then in 1830, a chap by the name of Charles Tanqueray, then aged 20, broke the mould, and rather than become a clergyman, he established his Bloomsbury distillery in London's Finsbury. Now, all these gins have established, all these families have been established, Tanqueray, Beefeater, all of these brands are established. Now, what gave them their distinctive style and what they known as London dry gin is all thanks to a chap by the name of Aeneas Coffey. Now, the beginning of the 19th century saw attempts to develop a still to speed and improve distilling process. In 1826, a chap by the name of Robert Stein invented a still consisting of 2 columns. So up until this point, you had the classic pot still, the brass heavy bottom thing with the swan's neck. He created a still that had 2 columns, meaning it could distill once, travel into the next column and distill again, rectifying it even further, making it much cleaner. An Irishman and patent officer cleric, Aeneas Coffey, considerably improved this design and patented his coffee still in 1831. So, column stills are also known as continuous stills because, as its name suggests, they can run continuously without the need to stop and start between batches, as in pot stills, aka alembic stills. So this, coupled with a higher concentration of alcohol in the final distillate, makes column stills much more economical to operate than pot stills. The coffee still enabled distillers to produce a much purer spirit on a much larger scale than was previously possible. And then by the middle of the 19th century, the quality of gin produced using clean spirits from the new continuous still was close to the standard spirit we enjoy today. So these gins that established back then, they're pretty much the same gins that we're trying to this day. Distillers reduced or omitted the sugar or sweeteners previously used to soften the harshness of the old style gins. This new style of gin eventually became known as dry gin and then London dry gin. The first London dry gins were more aromatic than it's sort of today's style. Which takes us on to our next style gin that we're going to try, which is Bloom's London Dry Gin. So guys, next up we're going to be trying London Dry Gin. Now, we like London Dry Gin. This is essentially gin as most people know it. When you think about brands of gin you purchase, brands like Tanqueray, Beefeater, all of those established brands, they are all London Dry Gins. Now, the ironic being is that it's a style of gin and it's now a legal category of gin defined by its production process. But despite the name, London Dry Gin can literally be produced anywhere in the world. It doesn't have to be produced in London. It stems from the fact that these first styles of gin and these families were based in London, but now it can literally be made anywhere in the world. The term now provides little indication to a gin's flavour other than it being dry due to the addition of sugar or sweeteners not being permitted. So, like I said, established with Aeneas Coffee's still invention, the continuous still, London Dry emerged as a dry, refined style of gin. Originally only made in London, soon after coffee's continuous still was invented, enabling production of highly rectified, nearly pure spirit. So your high 95, 96, 97% ABVs. The high distillation strength removed all the unpleasant flavours found in earlier gins, so these new spirits could be sold unsweetened or dry. So essentially when we think about London Dry gins, we think about heavy juniper forward gins with the classic botanicals such as coriander seeds, angelica root, citrus peel and orris root to be London Dry style. Classic examples of this style that still survive to this day, like I said before guys, are Tanqueray and Beefeater, although one is still produced in London, though both are bottled in Scotland. Within London, you have brands such as Sipsmith and Portobello Road are making a good example. But for today, guys, we wanted to move away from the classic ones that you probably have tried and might have seen before. Most people who are interested in gin would have tried Tanqueray, would have tried Gordon's, would have tried Beefeater. We wanted to highlight some brands that you might not have heard before, and now this is where we're going to head into those sort of area. So for our London Dry, we're going to be using Bloom. Now, Bloom is created by the master distiller of Greenall's. You might be familiar with Greenall's gin, Joanne Simcock. It's made using the same 7 botanicals, namely juniper, coriander, angelica, cubebs, sorry, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, chamomile, honeysuckle, and pomelo. So pomelos are a citrus fruit native to Southeast Asia, and they're also sometimes nicknamed a Chinese grapefruit. So this is going to be bottle number 4 in your box, guys. So if you want to go ahead and give that one a grab and a pour. So we picked this one as well, as it is actually not made in London. It's one of the London Dry gins that's not made in London, which you'll find is quite a common theme with a lot of London Dry gins. And now we arrive at, to me, what is gin? What is the defined style of gin that we think of? We've sort of started off here in the sort of Geneva category. We've headed into sweeter areas with things like Old Tom, Plymouth with its own distinct style of gin, and now we arrive at, to me, what is gin? What I think of as gin when we're coming up with cocktails and creating cocktails, London Dry Gin. This is the established style of gin. So juniper right in your face, on your nose, straight away. I think this one has quite a floral aroma to it as well. Almost moving into sort of violet sort of area as well. So if you go for a little taste now. Yeah, super floral, super piney. You've got that juniper. It's dry as hell, which is what you want from a London Dry gin. And it helps to create that sort of silky mouthfeel that you're looking for with these sorts of gins. There was some sort of softness and some sweetness there as well from the sort of things like the citrus fruits used as well. Things like the chamomile are going to help with that as well, and it's almost, some of those notes are quite delicate as well. Yeah, this is London Dry Gin. This is the thing that we all know and love today. This is what sort of established it. And thanks to Aeneas Coffee Still, we were able to create this crystal clear, beautiful distillate with all of this aroma and helped give gin its life back. So now we've got the technique for making gin. We've got this style of gin being created. Gin distilleries are popping up all over the place again. It was a sort of gin's next boom. But this time it was a much cleaner boom, a much safer boom, and due to, unfortunately, to its price range, it meant that only certain people could afford it now, meaning it was consumed by the wealthier classes. In 1850, Felix Booth of the Booth Distillery, one of the famous gin families, succeeded in pushing a private members' bill through the British Parliament, which removed duties on export gin. London's distillers were quick to seize opportunity and push their new quality dry gin style to new markets. Around this time, you saw the use of quinine starting to prop up. This pungent bark of the South American cinchona tree gives tonic its distinctive bitterness. This is the thing that gives tonic water, its bitterness. It was first used to treat malaria in Rome in 1631, quite a while ago. And the first known quinine-based tonic was launched by Erasmus Bond in 1858. So essentially, tonic was very popular in British colonies. We were exploring and we were moving all around invading, moving all around the world, expanding our new empire under Her Majesty Queen Victoria's rule. So especially in India, where malaria was quite prevalent, tonic was very, very popular. So Schweppes launched their first carbonated quinine tonic, Indian tonic water. The ladies and gentlemen of the Raj also drank phenomenal quantities of gin, as we bought it there as well. It is therefore accepted that gin and tonic emerged in India during the second half of the 19th century and was drunk partly for its anti-malarial properties. But like we saw in the origins of gin and the origins of distillation, what starts off as a medicinal use quickly turns into recreational use. When they realise you drink enough of it, you get pretty happy. So London Dry Gin was the preferred tipple of officers on board ships as well, although they would have also consumed Plymouth. This is where you see lots of naval-style drinks emerge. The gin and tonic would have been one such drink. Another would have been pink gin. Now, today, pink gin is known as a sweet strawberry-infused gin that can be purchased pretty much anywhere on the globe at this moment. But back in the day, pink gin was actually referred to as a drink where you would mix gin with Angostura bitters. Angostura bitters would have popped up around this time as well, used, like most things in alcohol relations, as a tonic or as a remedy. So mixing this with gin would have actually created what was known as pink gin. Literally, as you dash Angostura bitters into gin, it turns it into a pink hue. If you head to Plymouth, and if you're lucky enough to get invited into their secret bar, not many people get to go into there, and the location is not something that I'm allowed to disclose. They've actually got some examples of old bottlings of Plymouth in there. They've got one such kit, a pink gin kit, which has a tiny little bottle of Angostura bitters in there. Gin and soda would have been another popular one as well, garnished with something like lemon. This was also known as the British Soldier's Delight, while the gin and ginger beer mix was known as a Hatfield. You also would have seen limes being consumed by the sailors to prevent scurvy due to their vitamin C, I believe vitamin C. Biology is not my strong point. And limes were preserved using the cordial, therefore lime cordial and gin was mixed, therefore the gimlet was born. So lots of gin cocktails were popping up. Now, there's one event in booze history that affects many, many different brands, and it's always one that's referenced in history lessons when it comes to booze, and that was in 1863 with the phylloxera outbreak. So, Phylloxera vasterix, I always get that slightly wrong. This was a louse that attacked the roots of grapevines, eventually causing the death of the plant. This was discovered in French vineyards in 1863. Phylloxera devastated 90% of French vines and quickly spread throughout much of Europe. This wiped out French vineyards. This wiped out French wine, and obviously because cognac is made from grapes, this wiped out French cognac as well. Now, what did this mean? This meant in France and in the new French colonies, in places like New Orleans in America, cognac all but disappeared, and in France, absinthe took over, as some of you might have heard in Paddy's absinthe masterclass. But this crippled European wine and also the brandy industry for over a decade. It was well over a decade. American grapes, where the pest originated from, were found resistant to the creatures, so European vines were grafted to American rootstock, so making this new hybrid vine, which was resistant to the phylloxera attack. Although this solved the problem in the intervening years, sales of gin greatly benefited. So in London and in the UK, gin took over. France, it would have been something like absinthe. In America, things like whiskey. And then in 1890, you see the first leap forward towards what we see today, which is we moved away from this and this into this and this. The first clear gin bottles were created. So gin was originally sold in casks or earthenware crocks. In fact, going back to what I talked about before with gin palaces, if you looked above the bars in gin palaces, they had all the different casks of the different styles of gin they would have had, things like London Dry, Old Tom, etc. or they were served in earthenware crocks of the type used for your neighbour. It was not until the 1890s that improvements in glass technology allowed production of the first clear glass bottles, showing the clarity of this English. It was to show how clear and clean the spirit was. People needed to be reminded that the spirit was no longer the nasty stuff that they were consuming in the gin craze. This was clean, this was new, this was innovation. Following this development in 1907, the distinctive clear bottle and yellow Gordon's export guise was first created in celebration of a large, prestigious Australian export order placed in 1907. Prior to this, Gordon's green livery had remained effectively unchanged. So on and so forth. You see in 1902, Langley Distillery was established, much more distilleries established, but then disaster strikes again, and in 1920 to 1933, in the USA, you see prohibition. Now, while this didn't affect us and the way we consume spirits, this would have affected America and the way America consumes spirits greatly. It would have meant things like gin wouldn't have been able to be consumed, and this almost gave birth to their own sort of slight gin craze, as they sort of took to sort of alternative ways of creating spirits, and everything from medical alcohols till all sorts of things they would have used to create their own sort of fake gins, fake whiskies, fake vodkas, and so on and so forth. So they create some pretty nasty spirits and dangerous spirits as well. Formaldehyde was one thing that they used as well to create spirits. It was a pretty nasty time for them. And so America in 1919 embarked on this noble experiment, which we all know failed, and was eventually revoked. So when eventually it was repealed in 1933, on repeal day, Gordon's owners, Tanqueray Gordon, which was their new name as they'd established themselves as a joint distillery, they established a huge distillery and bottling plant in New Jersey in America. Another followed in Illinois in 1965, and a third hit California in 1971. The campaign to produce and sell large volumes of Gordon's in the lucrative US market is continued by owners Diageo to this day. So they established themselves there as well. You then hit the 1950s, and this London dry gin dominates. It is we're hitting into the Mad Men era. Cocktails are now a huge thing. This is the birth of the 3 martini lunches, where people would go out and they would get drunk in the middle of the day and then fall asleep for the rest of the day. And gin was the thing that grew in huge popularity. It was the clear spirit to have. Vodka was starting to have rumblings, and it was starting to have established sort of marketing. This is when Smirnoff would have brought out their Breathless campaign, as they claimed it had, it would leave you with no scent on your breath of alcohol. But gin was still the dominant. It was still the one in charge. In terms of clear spirits, it was the one that everyone was consuming. This was gin's big heyday. In 1953, you saw the coronation of the Queen Elizabeth II. This heralded a new start for a Britain that finally put the war behind it. We were past this, we were in a new era. Rationing was over, and this new feeling of prosperity helped drive gin sales in Britain. The fact that the coronation was televised also drove record sales of televisions. In America, sales of gin also soared as the coronation drove a craze for all things British. This Anglophile feeling kicked off, and gin was considered wholly British, so the world was consuming gin all over. Now, while in the 1950s and early 60s, gin had its boom, like I mentioned before, vodka was about to have its moment, and it was going to become slightly more fashionable than gin, as gin was eventually starting to become, into the 60s, it would eventually become known as sort of an old hat and past it. Gin's running partner as well, the cocktail, was also doomed. We're about to head into a dark era for cocktails making and for spirit making. And this was the 60s, this was counterculture, this was the time of the hippie, this was the time of drugs, LSD, free love, Woodstock, all that kind of stuff. People weren't interested in drinking gin. That was the thing your mum drank. That was the thing your horrible auntie that kissed you on the cheek at family gatherings drank. That was what they considered gin to be. And gin sort of held this reputation for quite a while. I sort of had that sort of reputation with gin growing up for a little bit. And it really did hold on. It sort of became old hat and something that old ladies drank. So gin lost its prevalence. It lost its place in the market. Vodka took over to a degree. Vodka was neutral. It didn't really taste of anything. You then hit the 70s, and we do have a cocktail boom in the 70s and 80s, but it's what's known as the dark era, the disco era of cocktail making, and it's all about sweet, bright, coloured, sugar-filled drinks. You don't want anything that's too floral or anything that's going to dominate those flavours that you're trying to get. So gin was not the thing that people reached for. They would have reached for vodka, they would have reached for spiced rum, that kind of stuff. And gin all but sort of fell to the back bar. It was sort of something that the older generation drank, and it sort of went away for a long time until you get to the new millennium, which is where we're getting to now, the modern era, sort of around 2000 to now. This is known as the second gin boom. So our computer survived the millennium bug, and despite predictions to the contrary, there was enough champagne for all to toast the new century. While 12 years earlier, the launch of Bombay Sapphire, because that's the thing as well, Bombay Sapphire, while established as a brand, was actually launched in the 80s. It marked gin's turning point. 2000 seemed to kick off the start of production of the plethora of new gin brands, including Tanqueray No. 10, Martin Miller's, and Hendrick's. So this is a new era of gin, this is a new era of style of gins. We're still producing London Dry, we're still producing those classic styles, but now this is the time for experimentation, this is time for new styles to appear, this is the time for new gins. So yes, so we're in this new golden era of gin making, and many of different distilleries have popped up, and the abundance of gin is everywhere. Gin palaces are sort of back in the form of gin bars that you can now go to, where they boast quite literally hundreds of different styles of gin from all over the globe. And like I said, guys, brands like Hendrick's were established, Martin Miller's were established. Brands like Tanqueray started innovation with things like the Tanqueray No. 10 that these new styles of gin where they were exploring different things and trying new styles. One we wanted to mention as well, guys, and we're going to be talking about is Roku. It's a Japanese gin. Like with the London Dries, we know you've tried things like Hendrick's before and Tanqueray No. 10. We wanted to show you maybe something that you've seen but maybe haven't tried before, so we wanted to highlight Roku. So this is a Japanese gin. Roku is literally the Japanese word for 6. And it's very appropriate as it's in a hexagon style bottle and it features 6 Japanese botanicals. Those Japanese botanicals are, and I'm going to read the back of the label because I always forget. So it contains sakura flower, yuzu peel, sencha tea, sansho pepper, sakura leaf, and gyokuro tea. So as well as these 6 Japanese botanicals, there were also 8 more traditional gin botanicals, including that all-important juniper. So it's got 14 botanicals in total. So if you want to give this one a pour, guys, this is going to be bottle number 5 from your box. So on the nose, guys, like with the London Dry style, you're still going to have that lovely floral, piney aroma to it. I get a little bit more Parma Violet-y sort of floral notes in this one as well. And if you dig deep and sort of really try and look for it, there's almost some cherry blossom and a little bit of green tea in there as well. But like I said, don't worry if you can't fully detect those sorts of those aromas. So go for a taste now. Super, super silky on the mouth for this one, guys. It's super, super appealing. It's got a punch of flavour on the palate. You get that sort of cherry blossom, the green tea, tannins really cut through on this one. Slightly oily as well on the mouth. And then you get that beautiful spice and that piney juniper that you look for with gin. Yeah, this one is really, really good. You can almost see that sort of like almost oil-like hit in the light on the top of the gin. It's got a really, really long finish on it as well, guys. Those flavours keep going for ages, all that sort of dryness along your palate, and with all the sort of sweet floral notes. I love this gin. It's a really, really, really big gin with lots of punches, lots of flavours. I would go for this one as something like a dry martini to really let this gin sing. So this, along with many different styles of gins, have been emerging over sort of the past sort of 10 to 20 years. In 2006, so a chap by the name of Ryan Margarian, a well-known bartender and consultant based in Portland, Oregon. He created a new gin called Aviation, a new American style of gin. That's recently been purchased, a large stake of that was purchased by the actor Ryan Reynolds, giving it some attention. It was recently purchased by Diageo as well, the chaps that own Tanqueray and Gordon's as well. So that's a new Western style of gin. So it's no longer London Dry, it's a new Western style of gin. In 2008, you saw a huge revival of Old Tom, thanks to the chaps at Hayman's Gin Distillery in London. They have apparently a classic old school style of the 1800s recipe for Old Tom. So they started producing Old Tom as well. So they sort of set the standard for Old Tom and gave birth to how all of these brands now have their Old Tom. Helped re-establish this brand of Old Tom gin. In 2008, the EU had some gin definitions. So on 20th of February 2008, a new EU definition recognising and legislating what can be termed as a gin passed into EU law. Brexit. as part of the revised EU spirit drink regulations. These rules include 3 distinctive definitions of gin. Gin, distilled gin, and London gin. Their introduction led to some gins being forced to change their labelling, with gins such as Martin Miller's no longer being able to use the term London dry gin due to additional flavourings being added after distillation. And then in 2008 to 2010, you saw the craft gin distillers boom in a huge ways. 2 arcane English laws stood in the way of British craft distilling renaissance following that already underway in the United States. One, a law which dated back to the 1800s, stated that brewers could not also be distillers on the same site. A second stated that the minimum size for a pot still should not be less than 18 hectolitres. There was probably some truth in the suspicion that law on still size was designed to suit existing large distillers. A law requiring new stills in the UK to be a massive 18 hectolitres effectively prevented small boutique distillers providing unwanted competition. 2 pioneer distillers changed the 18 hectolitre law. William Chase, who set up Chase Distillery on the Herefordshire farm in 2008, and Sam Goldsworthy and Fairfax Hall, favourite names, who established their Sipsmith Distillery in the Residence Street in London's Hammersmith in 2009. Sipsmith's first copper pot still, Prudence, has a diminutive 300-litre charge capacity. So this is the birth of big craft distilleries. That big in terms of their reach, but small in terms of the size of the gin they were producing. The ancient law preventing breweries from also distilling had not been challenged because previously no modern day distiller had also dreamt of selling beer. And conversely, it would appear that no other brewer had passionately wanted to also be a distiller. This was until Jonathan Adnams, chairman of the Suffolk Coast Brewers Adnams, decided he wanted to be a distiller as well as a brewer. In January 2010, Adnams applied to HM's Customs and Excise for a distilling license, and to their delight, was granted a distiller's license on the 3rd of April 2010. By September, they had installed German stills, the first vodka coming out of their stills at 4 p.m. in the afternoon on the 14th of October 2010. So boom, the second gin craze is kicked off, and it is still going to this day. The world has and is rediscovering gin. The G&T, for so long the mainstay spirit and mixer served in British pubs, is now one of the world's best-selling drinks, with bars around the world not only offering a bewildering range of gins, but a choice of tonic, waters and garnishes. It's not uncommon to head into these new formed gin palaces and be given a what was the equivalent of a cocktail list, but really it's just a list of gins, tonics and recommended garnishes for those gins. Gin festivals are happening all over the UK. The variations of all of these things are now more complicated than the variables of coffee ordered at Starbucks. It's quite literally endless, the possibilities. But recently as well, you've seen a further boom in the gin market, which has been reaching a market of people that maybe don't like gin and maybe aren't a big fan of that heavy juniper hit or that real dry sort of botanicalness. And that's in the flavoured gin market, which has been capturing the hearts of people for the last few years. And that's the next and final gin that we're going to be trying in this plethora of gins that we've explored. So as I mentioned before, guys, originally pink gin was a cocktail served, or sort of cocktail served, to naval officers on ships, a mix of gin and Angostura bitters to sort of as a medicinal remedy. Whereas now pink gin is essentially known as a strawberry infused gin or a raspberry infused gin. And over the last few years, we've seen all the sort of the main brands of gin establishing their own flavoured gins. Brands like Beefeater have got things like this blood orange gin that we're going to be trying, as well as a pink gin. Gordon's have got a pink gin out. Even brands like Tanqueray have tipped their sort of hat towards it, opting for things like Sevilla, their Sevilla orange gin, or Rangpa, their Rangpa lime gin. It's endless. It's sort of breathed a new life into the gin market, and it's been going for the sort of last couple of years. And it's created a new demand for gin in a way that it didn't exist before. People who weren't drinking gin before have now turned to drinking gin. Your pink gin and lemonade has now become a staple in gin drinkers' sort of repertoire. And so today we're going to be trying the Beefeater Blood Orange Gin. Okay guys, so if you want to grab bottle number 6, the final of the little labelled bottles from your box, this one's easy to sort of spot as it is the luminous orange, quite vividly orange liquid. So you want to add that one into your glass, guys. On the nose, for me personally, anything that resembled gin that you might have got from these classic ones has pretty much gone. To me, on the nose, it straight away it's giving me those instant jelly packets you used to get from your sort of store cupboard that your mum would make jelly out of, those orange jellies. Yeah, the gin aromas are pretty much subdued, but in terms of flavour, yeah, the first thing you get, it's intensely orange. It's intensely orange, but there is that gin flavour there in the background, as Beefeater use their gin as the base of this one. It is a premium gin mixed with a hint of blood orange. So you do get those sort of, once you try it, the aroma's sort of lost, but the flavour is all still there. It's still really gin. It's not as sweet as some of the other pink gins I've seen on the market, or the other flavoured gins I get on the market. It still has that juniper hit and that classic Beefeater flavour that you want, making Beefeater one of the most popular gin brands in the world. And the sort of aftertaste is still quite dry, it's still quite long, it still lingers around as well, and it still has all that sort of famous ginness. Yeah, there are many flavoured gins on the market. We just wanted to highlight one of them, one that we quite like. I quite like this one. Some of them, they divulge into, they're not quite spirits, sometimes they're not even technically legally classed as spirits, making them not even close to a gin, despite having the gin on the label. Whereas this one I feel still retains some of that gin flavour. Even brands like Hendrick's are now sort of heading into the flavoured market with different expressions of what they're creating. So there's lots to explore in the gin world, and it's still here, guys. It's still sticking around. It ain't going anywhere anytime soon. There's still lots to try. And if you do enjoy this category of spirit, and if you are still a big fan of it, there is plenty out there for you to try. So that's it for trying spirits, guys. That's the history of gin. It is a long one. There is some pretty horrendous dark moments in its life, but we're through it now, and thanks to us getting past all of those horrible moments, we've got some pretty damn tasty spirits to try. Now, enough with trying spirits. We are a cocktail delivery service. Let's actually make some cocktails, guys. So we're going to be making 2 cocktails today. Both are connected in a way, and both come from sort of one of the first glory eras of the new style of gin, the London Dry Gin, when it was at its height. Okay, guys, the first of the 2 cocktails we're going to be making, we're going to be using our pouch. Hopefully that's in the freezer right now, chilling, making it nice and icy cold, as we're making a martini today, guys. Now, martinis have lots of reputations around them about how they're served, how they're supposed to be served, what garnish you use, etc. There's many different styles of martini out there. And actually, the 2 cocktails we're exploring in today's masterclass both are an example of how gin and vermouth are used in a cocktail, but this is, they're very different in styles of cocktail as well. So first up, we have a classic martini. So the origins of where the martini come from, no one is really sure. There's no real truth to any story. No one's sure if the dry martini came first or the brand martini came first. It's disputed all over the place. As always with these cocktail stories, it happened so long ago that no one is really certain. And when they make these drinks, no one's really certain they're making something that's going to last hundreds of years, so the stories get a little bit lost. But today we're going to be making a classic martini, which is sort of a bit of an oxymoron, as, like I said, there's so many different ways you can have a martini. Martinis can differ from everything from the mix of vermouth to the spirit ratio, whether that spirit is gin or vodka, how you garnish it with olive, with a lemon, with cocktail onion. It goes on and on and on and on. And to this day, usually customers that opt for a martini in a bar will have their own preference for how they like it. Winston Churchill was quite famous for having his martinis quite literally bone dry. It's essentially a glass of cold stirred down gin. So when we talk about a dry martini, what we mean is it's a blend of dry gin with a hint of dry vermouth. Meaning if your ratio of gin to vermouth is quite high to gin, quite low to vermouth, it is quite a dry cocktail. The less dry vermouth in the cocktail, the drier it is, if that makes sense. It's always confused me, that statement. And the more dry vermouth you have in that, because when we're talking about a dry martini, we are talking about the French style of vermouth or dry vermouth. The more vermouth you have in the cocktail, the wetter it becomes. So if you literally do equal parts gin to vermouth, that's a wet martini. But today we're talking about dry martinis. Now, if you then chose to garnish that martini with a lemon, you'd sort of have a typical dry martini. If you chose to whack in some olives in there, maybe a little bit of olive brine modeled in there, you might have a dirty martini. If you opted to garnish it with some cocktail onions and a little bit of the brine from the cocktail onions, you would have a Gibson. If you then chose to mix it with vodka and gin, with the famous vermouth Quina Lillet, you have a Vesper martini from James Bond. They vary in all sorts of styles. We wanted to stick to something quite traditional today. We wanted to give you a traditional martini. We've not gone super dry. Your usual ratios of vermouth to gin is about 5 to 1. So you think I've had martinis that are about 75 ml of gin to sort of 15 ml of vermouth. That's quite dry. We wanted to let the vermouth come through and sing a little bit with this cocktail, guys, so we've gone for 3 to 1 today. So 3 parts gin to 1 part vermouth. Now, that doesn't mean we've put 3 shots of gin in here. What that means is we've done about 60 ml of gin to about 20 ml of vermouth. So what you're going to need, guys, is you're going to need a martini glass like I've got here. I've thrown some ice in there to chill that down. And then you just need to grab your pouch and we're literally going to pour it into the glass. Now, for garnish, you can have it your way. If you've got some olives and want to go for olives, go for that. If you've got some cocktail onions, you want to go for those, go for those. We have given you a lemon, and what I've just done is I've just peeled off a piece of lemon peel that I'm going to be using to garnish mine with. I'm just using a simple Y peeler. And then we want to save this lemon as well, guys, as we're going to be using the juice of it for our second cocktail. So once your glass is nice and chilled and cold, like mine is, essentially all you need to do is drop the liquid. Drop your ice off, of course. I've got mine chilled and ready to go here, into your glass, from your pouch. It's nice and cold, it's diluted, it's ready to go. Grab your lemon peel, just zest it over the top, give it a little twist. Now, you can opt to either drop it in or place it to one side. I like to place mine to one side because I find if I leave it in there for too long while I'm sipping, essentially I start to just drink a glass of lemon rather than the sort of complexities that I'm looking for my gin. I just want that lemon to just sort of sit on the top and give it a bit of aroma. But of course, if you feel like dropping yours in, go ahead. Like I said, these drinks are sort of have it your way to a degree. But that's how we make our first cocktail today, guys, the dry martini. So cheers, everyone. Now, this is not going to be for everyone. First time I tried one of these, I absolutely hated it because it was quite literally a glass of booze. Some of you may have had these before and love them, some probably hate them, but we just wanted to show you the way that we like to make a martini. We love to use Tanqueray for our martinis, either Tanqueray regular London Dry or Tanqueray number 10 are my preferred two. Plymouth also makes a delicious martini. And then we've just mixed this with, we've actually mixed it with some local vermouth. The chaps down in Cornwall at Nighthall Wines actually make a delicious dry vermouth, which is the one we've used to mix with this today. And for me, that just makes an absolutely delicious martini. So cheers, everyone. Hopefully you're enjoying that. And next up, we're going to be making a drink called the Clover Club. Okay, guys, so for this next drink, what you're going to need, we're going to be shaking our cocktail. So I've got my cocktail shaker ready. You're going to need the 2 unmarked bottles from your box. One's the round bottle, one's a little square bottle. These contain both the gin and syrup that we're using today for our second cocktail. So the second drink we're going to be making is another gin and vermouth cocktail, but a completely different style to the first martini that we've made. This is a drink called the Clover Club. Now, the Clover Club cocktail is a long-lost delight. Like all of these drinks, its story is based in myth. No one's quite sure who created it, who was the name of the person that was the first person to have created it. What we do know is that it was the preferred drink of a pre-prohibition gentleman's club called the Clover Club. It was a Philadelphia men's group that met regularly at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel from the 1880s to the 1920s. And this was a cocktail that they consumed, hence the name the Clover Club. It was the Clover Club. Then, like a decade or so later, it started appearing in publications. Recipes have varied, but essentially what we've made today is a classic version of it for you guys to have at home. So, as you guessed it, 2 of the ingredients are gin and vermouth. We've gone for Bombay London Dry, so a different style of London Dry today. And we've also used a rosé vermouth. Traditionally, the drink used dry vermouth. We wanted to use rosé vermouth today to show an example of a different style of vermouth to use. So this is what you're going to find in bottle number 1, guys. So grab bottle number 1, add it into your shaker. Just going to measure some out here. This is a mix I've got of dry vermouth and the gin. Now we need to grab our lemon that's left over from our martini, cut it in half. Now grab 1/2 of that lemon. Now I've got a lemon juicer here. If you don't have one, don't worry. All you can do is you can just hold it against the side of whatever you're going to be shaking the cocktail in, give it a good squeeze and try and get as much lemon out of that as possible. But we're just going to be squeezing off 1/2 of our lemon into our shaker. Then if you grab the second bottle you've got, this is a raspberry syrup. Traditionally the cocktail had fresh raspberries muddled in it. Raspberries are out of season at the moment, so we'd like to encourage people to use syrups and things like that to preserve them. But yeah, so we've got a raspberry syrup that we're going to add in there. And that's everything, guys. So we've got some gin, vermouth, a little bit of lemon, and some raspberry in there. So essentially, it's kind of behaving like a gin sour, but we've got that sort of kind of martini-esque-ness there as well with things like citrus, lemon, gin, and vermouth. So all that's left to do now is ice up our shaker. So I think as well that the original cocktail used egg white to create that sort of foamy head texture. We obviously still don't use egg whites when we're doing these sorts of presentations. We like to use something a little bit more sustainable, a little bit more friendly to use. So we've used the Miss Better's foamer as well, which will be found in the first bottle that you've added in as well. So it's going to help give the cocktail a nice big foam on it. So once you've got your ice in there, we're going to give this one a good hard shake. Give that one a shake for around 10 seconds, guys, so it's nice and icy cold. Once you separate it off, you'll see that there's a nice big lot of foam formed on your cocktail. Grab yourself a strainer just to hold back the ice. Grab a second coupe glass, and then we're just going to strain that one in. And you can see it's got this lovely pink colour to the cocktail. As well as also in your kit, guys, you should have had a garnish pick with some freeze-dried raspberries. So what you want to do is just place those ones onto your pick, like so, and then just place them over the top of the glass. And there we have it, guys. That is how we make our second cocktail, the Clover Club. Thank you very much. Now in taste, nothing like the martini. So it's kind of showing how gin and vermouth is used in different ways. You've got sort of two spectrums here, sort of a gin sour and a classic dry martini, and the variations of gin and vermouth and how they're used. So there we have it, guys. There's a little, well, more than a little insight into gin's history. Like we said, it spans literally 500 years of development and through some pretty dark times to get to where we know it today. Hopefully you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Hopefully you've now found some gin styles that you might not have tried before. And who knows, maybe you're currently grabbing yourselves a bottle of Old Tom or a bottle of your neighbour to try again. Coming up next, we're going to be having St. Patrick's Day, a celebration of Irish cocktails. Paddy's going to be hosting that one, so keep an eye out on our Stir Crazy website for when that box goes live. As always, we're following government advice, so keep an eye out as hopefully our bars will be open soon to serve you for outside service, depending on government guidelines. As always, thank you for myself and the team at Stir Crazy. Stay safe, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.